we're in the capital of the Renaissance, and one of the themes I've been pushing a lot on the conference circuit is to handle the sort of problems of the current day, we need a Renaissance, not an Enlightenment. It's kind of like, not because I'm a Catholic and the Enlightenment was Protestant, though there are elements of that within the way this works. But the Renaissance was the discovery of old things as well as a reinvention of the new. It wasn't an attempt to throw everything out and replace it. And if you go back to Vico, who's one of my favorite Italian philosophers, he basically says of the Enlightenment, look guys, you've got some really great ideas here, but why are you abandoning everything which we knew from the past? I've just come back from Australia, where we've been combining our research techniques with indigenous people in Australia, and the things they know about the land which we've lost completely. So this concept of Renaissance is a concept of the old and the new, reimagining, rediscovering, and I want to hold that theme. I'll talk in a minute or two about one of the key complexity concepts, which is distributed decision-making, which is very different from delegated decision-making. And distributed decision-making is one of the ways we overcome those sort of problems. So you'll start to see these come through. So let's go through some basic science, and sorry for people who've seen this before, but it's a basic one. First one is this. For some reason we don't understand, radiologists have offended the cognitive neuroscience community. They obviously did something really evil at some point in their past, so all the experiments are run on them. So if you give radiologists a batch of x-rays and ask them to look for anomalies, and on the final x-ray you put a picture of a gorilla which is 48 times the size of a cancer nodule, then 83% of radiologists will not see it, even though their eyes physically scan it. And the 17% who do see it come to believe they were wrong when they talk to the 83% who didn't. This is called inattentional blindness, and it's a part of what we are as a species. If you think about the early hominids, the way you make decisions is you scan about 3 to 5% of the available data. That's the most you'll take account of. That triggers a series of memories, and they're not just cognitive. We're into post-Cartesian models of consciousness now. Consciousness is a distributed function of the brain, the body, and its social interactions. It's not identical with the brain. So basically that triggers cognitive memories, physical memories, social memories through stories and accounts of things we've heard from other people. We blend those together. It's called conceptual blending. This is happening in nanoseconds. And the first blended pattern which fits, we apply. So based on a very partial data scan, we do a first fit pattern match and we act accordingly. Now, if you think about evolution, you can see why we do that. If you think about the early hominoids on the savannas of Africa, something large and yellow with very sharp teeth runs towards you at high speed. Do you want to autistically scan all available data, look up a catalogue of the flora and fauna of the African veldt, and have an identified lion, look up best practice case studies on how to avoid lions? By that time, the only document of any use to you will be the book of Jonah from the Old Testament, which is the only example I've found of a manual of how to escape from the digestive tract of a large carnivore written by a survivor. We evolved to make decisions very, very quickly, privileging our most recent collective or individual experiences. And that's how you all make decisions. And that isn't going to change. So build in decision support systems and strategy processes based on the assumption that if everybody has the right information and the right training, they will make the right decisions, is fundamentally flawed. So we have to rethink that one a little bit because it's going to be different. Oh, and by the way, we have to find the 17% before they talk to the 83%. Yeah, and actually the golden news on this is there are huge opportunities out there waiting to be discovered, but we don't see them because we do not see what we do not expect to see. And if you come to myself, Gary Klein, who's one of the other 5 schools of sense-making, Brenda Dervin, what all of us say is there's no such thing as a cognitive bias. They are all cognitive heuristics. In evolutionary terms, they all have advantages at a species level, which is why they've evolved. So trying to overcome them, again, is a fundamental mistake. Being aware of them, that's different, but you can't overcome them. And I'll talk about some methods for that in a minute. The second thing is I assume that all of you who have children tell them stories. Everybody, bedtime stories, things like that. Do you tell them stories about how Janet and John stayed at home, conformed with the family mission statement, achieved the family KPIs? I mean, you don't tell stories like that, do you? Basically, all fairy stories in all storytelling traditions, basically have doom, disaster, despondency, despair, and failure built into them. We have a happy ending because we kind of like want them to sleep at night, but we hold that off as long as possible because we want to scare, to use an Irish phrase, the living Jesus out of them, because actually sharing failure is a more successful evolutionary strategy than sharing success. The human brain actually picks up on failure faster than success. What stories spread around companies? Stories of failure, stories of success. We evolved as malicious gossips because it has evolutionary advantage. We actually now build worse practice systems for companies. Worse practice systems have more learning in them than best practice systems. You can use fiction to create them. Fiction evolved so we could share ideas of failure which were purely fictional or which were true, but we don't want to say we did it. One of the things, there's lots of things we do with fiction in that way. One of the things we now do on mission statements, anybody got a corporate mission statement? Remember them? Okay, mission statements started with ACOF. Then the consultants stopped making money out of them, so they decided we'd have common values. Everybody remember that period? Then that sort of got a bit boring, so they created purpose. Somebody made a lot of money out of the book on purpose. And just to scare you, the next book coming out is called Deep Purpose. So the cycle is about to start again. And each time we go around this cycle, the same consultants sit with the same executives and write the same platitudes on the same flip charts. And their poor employees, it's like Moses comes down from the mountain with the tablets and you're all meant to follow it. We take a different approach. We actually agree the defining stories of what we don't want to be. Because that actually is much easier to get a consensus, and it leaves open possibilities that we couldn't have anticipated, which we can explore. And if you look at the Bible, it tells it asks questions through stories, or it makes you aware of what you shouldn't do. It never really tells you what you should do. And that's true of all storytelling traditions. So, and also, by the way, narrative is still the fundamental sense-making method of everybody. I've done loads of work with engineers over the world. The real learning is done through micro-stories over a beer in a shift change. So if we can capture and use those stories, that's very effective. And I can do more about that in tomorrow's masterclass. And the final one is complexity. This has now become fashionable. The world and his wife now have complexity methods. It's just getting really terrible because they're reading the Wikipedia entry on it, and that's the limit of their study before they create a certification in it. So we're trying to get some authenticity into this. The best metaphor I've ever seen for complexity is from Alicia Gerraro. She says it's like bramble bushes in a thicket. Bramble bushes are those sort of very thorny things which produce wonderful fruits, and a thicket is a small woodland. Now aside from long-distance cycling, I do 200 kilometers on that cycle. I also love long-distance walking. And I go walking with two doctors, which you would think was a good idea, except that one of them insists on, he doesn't like tracks. If you've ever been led into actually a small woodland stocked with bramble bushes because he wants to discover a 19th century Welsh ruined farm, you kind of like realize the danger of entanglement. Everything is connected with everything else. You can't actually take it apart and put it back together again. If you go to the Greek and Latin roots of the words complexity and complicated, complicated is to fold, and if you fold something, you can unfold it. Complex is to entangle, and you can't untangle something once it's entangled. So complexity is a very different way of thinking, and by the way, it's a phase shift between whether a system is ordered or whether it's complex in terms of the way things work. So what I want to do is to give you in this first part of this a sort of brief view of what complexity is about. The key thing to understand is that there is no linear material causality. What actually happened at the time of Kant and the Enlightenment is everybody forgot Aristotle talked about 4 causes. They focused on just one of them. And the trouble is, we now all think that's the case. It's called fundamental attribution error. If something happens, we assume it has a cause. Now, the reality is it doesn't. If you've ever read, anybody read the congressional report on 9/11? Okay, it's worth reading. It's actually quite valuable. I spent a huge amount of my life working on counterterrorism before and after 9/11 and working with that report. But if you look at any government report on something which has gone wrong, they always look backwards, and with the benefit of the hindsight, they come up with this lovely phrase, why didn't we join up the dots? Everybody familiar with that phrase? Kind of like, now we're looking backwards, we can see why these things happen. So if somebody been trained to take off and fly but not land, we now realize the significance of it, so we celebrate that person, we promote them, and we write new laws and new procedures so that that won't happen again. Everybody familiar with this? Okay. Well, your first question for the day is a quick one on dots. Yeah? So if I actually have 1, 2, 3, 4 dots, then there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 linkages between the dots. So 4 dots is 6 linkages. I'll give you the figure. It's 64 possible patterns that can emerge from the dots and the links between the dots. If I go up to 10 dots, what's that figure? Guesses, please. I don't want the formula, I want a number. So 4 dots is 64, 10 dots. What's the number? Shout out the number. You haven't got time to calculate it, you've got to guess. 2 million. How many people think 2 million is too high? Too low? Not putting your hand up because you know you're going to get it wrong, and yeah, okay. It's actually too low. Any more guesses? Okay, I'll put you out of your misery. It's actually just over 3.4 trillion. If I go up to 12, it's just over 4.8 quadrillion. There's an old story in China called the Emperor's Chessboard, where a sage asks for a reward, says, I'll have 1 grain of rice on the first square of the chessboard, double thereafter. There is enough rice in China. How many dots are there in the human system? How many possible patterns are there? Yeah? The idea, and this is actually, we can get into free will if you want later on this, the minute you get into a human organism, there are so many possible connections and permutations, you can't predict anything from the particles at a low level. Everything, and you can't actually apply retrospective coherence. So what we have to do, and this is a key phrase, we have to manage in the present moment, not in a desired future state. Yeah, and this is a key phrase within complexity in terms of the way we work. So going into this in more detail, first of all, just to be clear on this, complexity thinking is not a subset of systems thinking. They have different antecedents. There are some overlaps between the two, but you can see the difference between complexity science and systems thinking. That sort of says everything. They are actually not the same thing. One comes from a scientific background, the other comes from information theory from Shannon. And there's intersections from time to time, but they're actually different. Yeah?